Hello again. I am so glad to have you here with us. We are continuing our walk through the Bible together, and we are skipping ahead a little bit in the story. I am really excited to be looking at this passage today. It is this really neat passage. It's really a fascinating piece of the story, and I don't know we cover it always. It is the call of David and how God chooses David to be king. Now, this is about 400 years ahead of our last story. Our last point was we were talking about the people of Israel being in the wilderness. God had brought them out of slavery in Egypt into the wilderness. They spend 40 years in the wilderness, and then they come into the promised land. Now, what you need to know about that is between then and this story, the people of Israel have settled into the land that God promised them. They had a period of about 300 years, which is known as the time of the Judges. And these weren't a king in the sense that we think of it, but somebody that God would appoint. And God would appoint Gideon or Deborah or Samuel, or no, well, not Samuel, I'm sorry, that was a prophet, but somebody else to be part, to rule over Israel, to protect them, to judge them, to settle disputes. And then it was how do I want to put it? It was an unsettled time. There's a ton going on there. It was absolutely fascinating. So the people of Israel then cry out to God for a king, and God gives them Saul as a king. But what happens is Saul is up and down as a king. He does some things that God really likes. God chooses him to be king after all. But then he gets outside of what God has called him to do. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 15, God says, this just ain't working anymore. And so I am going to remove Saul as king. And what happens is God recognizes this. Samuel, the prophet, recognizes this, but Saul himself doesn't recognize it. And nobody else in the nation of Israel recognizes it. So you've got this space where everybody says to Saul, hey, you're in charge. And God's like, no, that guy over here, he's the one in charge. And it sets up all this drama and fascinating story. And one of my long-standing critiques is I am surprised that there is not more stuff mining the life of David for TV and dramas and such. And I know occasionally somebody will try to make a TV series out of it. And somebody did one on NBC about 10, 12 years ago. And I watched the first episode or two of it, and I'm like, it's boring. How can you make this boring? There's so much good stuff in here. Anyway, regardless, it is a unbelievable story. So we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, and I want to look at the first 13 verses of this today. And so what happens is God says to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as a king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen him. I have chosen one of his sons as king. Now, this is an interesting point, that God says to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul? And it reveals something about human nature. Oftentimes, we know in our heads something's wrong. We need to move on from it. We need to be over it. We need to be done with it. But our heart doesn't know it yet. Our heart isn't ready to move on. And I can tell you all this from personal experience. I can tell you this about big stuff and about little stuff. Sometimes we're called to a new place and our heart's not ready to move on. So just be aware of that. And I'm going to skip over a little bit. It's interesting, and I'll let you get that into your small group. So Samuel goes up to Bethlehem. Now, of course, as anybody who knows the story of Jesus knows, this is where Jesus is born, in Bethlehem. And this is why he's born, because he's from the house of David. This is all set up 1,000 years before Jesus. This is approximately the year 1000 BC, roundabouts. Okay, So Saul goes to find Jesse. Jesse is a guy with a whole lot of kids, and he's there in Bethlehem. And he gets there, and he consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to the sacrifice. He's got this big heifer. He's going to make a sacrifice, which means you ritually kill the animal, and then you burn it as a sacrifice for God. And it's an interesting piece just to think about, that when you sacrifice something, you are sacrificing something that matters. It was very clear in the Bible that when they made a sacrifice at the temple, or in a case like this, because this is pre the temple being built, that you used a good animal. You didn't use an animal that was lame or blind. You didn't use it to say, well, I want to dispose of this, so I'll just sacrifice it. It's something good, something important, something valuable. It has to be a sacrifice. So what happens is, Jesse brings all his sons to Samuel. And when he first sees Eliab, he thinks, okay, this is the one here. Because he's tall, he's handsome, he's good looking. And God says, no. And God says to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things as man looks at them. Man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at his heart. Remember, Saul was like the tallest guy in Israel, and that's part of why he was king, because he was tall. As a tall person, I like these things, but that's me. Okay, so Jesse calls Abinadab and has him pass in front of Samuel, and again Samuel says, the Lord has not chosen that one either. And this keeps on going. And Jesse has 7 sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel says, the Lord has not chosen these. So finally he says, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse says, no, wait, there's one more. He's out tending the sheep. And Samuel says, we'll wait for him. Bring him here. Now, it's important to remember, he's got all these sons, and the least important, least favorite, is the one who would be out tending the sheep. This was not a good job. And so, Lord says, so David finally gets there. He says he's ruddy, with a fine appearance, and handsome features. And the Lord said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brother. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in the power. That's such a powerful verse. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. So here's what I want you to get out of this. God is calling David, and God is giving him a ministry. And the only ones who know it are the only ones who know it are Samuel and David and David's family. That's it. But it's this calling that he has. And there's stuff that's going to be going on here. And I find this whole thing so enthralling, because you've got this tension built up between a king whose power is gone and a king whose power is on him, but nobody knows. And the story plays out with all the stuff happening. The very next thing is David and Goliath. And you go on from the Civil War and Saul's jealousy and all this amazing stuff happening. And I hope you enjoy this story as much as I do. All right, before we get into discussion questions, I want you to take a minute, check in with your group, see how everybody's doing, and then we will get into the discussion questions. Question number 1. Have you ever bought in on first impressions and then discovered afterwards, this is not what I thought it was? Could be a person, could be a place, could be a place to eat. Some of the things I was thinking about. Question 2. Think about Samuel mourning for Saul. Think about how he is sad over what he knows has to happen. Have you ever been in that situation? Felt like there's something that you're sad for, mourning for, even though you know it's the right thing? Okay, why do you think Samuel says Eliab is going to be the chosen one? What do you think is going on there? How do you think David's brothers felt about being passed over? They go from all the stuff from oldest to youngest, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, it's not me? Have you ever been in a place where you felt passed over? Okay, this story is really based on God passing over a tradition and saying, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go with the oldest. We're going to go with the youngest. Where else does that happen? Where God surprises us with the people he chooses. Where else has that surprised us? With God ignoring a tradition. Here's a question that might be challenging. Have you ever been ashamed to be seen with a fellow Christian because of their appearance or their attitude or the way they speak? And last question, what is God calling you to do despite other people's protests? Thank you for tuning in again. I really have been enjoying these stories. I hope you have been enjoying them too. I hope the studies that we have been doing have drawn you closer to God and that you've come to know him better and have a fresher relationship with him. We will continue to pray for you, and may God bless you all.